Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming in early a little bit. I'm Paula Bartholomew, and glad you're here. I'm going to share some holistic health news, and we're going to have a brief conversation with our presenter, Tami Chu, before we start the webinar. Tami's going to be presenting on obesity and the gut microbiome. So just a reminder that you're muted, but please participate by posting your questions and comments into the webinar panel at any time. And pay attention to that panel throughout the presentation because Alex will be posting any URLs, things like that, so you can have that information easily. We had a great webinar on the beginning of the month with Dr. Dina Rose. She presented on how nutrition professionals can influence the way kids eat. It was about changing the conversation from nutrition to habits. It was fabulous. So we recorded that webinar. We're going to record this one too. So Hawthorn students will have access to Dina Rose's recording up on your student website. Everybody will have access to Tami Chu's. Another thing, All About Alumni is an online event where we showcase Hawthorn graduates. This is a 30-minute segment where they give a presentation. We follow it with 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, so you can ask questions directly. These air on noon Pacific time on the first Wednesday of each month. And so that puts us into tomorrow's first Wednesday, October 5th. And I hope you'll join us live for a webinar with our graduate, Megan Fisher, who's going to be presenting on holistic health and fitness, really focusing on how to evolve your niche in the whole health and in a red state. So red states, find out what red states are. It's all about legality and practice. And Megan has a lot of experience with this. So check it out. And our last All About Alumni was with Tracy Fox, and she talked a lot also about working in restricted states and how she evolved her practice by working primarily with other doctors. Also, there's going to be a survey for you to fill out after this webinar, and it's really an opportunity for you to give us feedback, to give us your thoughts, ask questions, and let us know what you'd like to hear more about in upcoming webinars. Thanks for filling it out and taking the time. I really pay attention to it. It helps me know what you want and be able to serve your needs the best. And in our last webinar with Dr. Dina Rose, Dr. Dina Rose offered a copy of her book, It's Not All About Broccoli, and we have a winner, Nisha Arden, won the drawing for this. And so a signed book is coming to Nisha right now as we speak. And I think we have a few minutes here, so I want to take the opportunity and have a little conversation with Tami a minute. So Tami, are you with us?
I'm here.
All right, great. Really glad to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be fun. It's exciting. So I thought it would be interesting. You have a great topic, very interesting topic, and I thought it would be interesting for you to share a little bit about what prompted your interest in microbiome.
Well, I've always been fascinated with how the body works, and in the last 4 or 5 years, while I was at Hawthorn, I was doing research on different topics and came across this gut microbiome that seemed to have so much to do with everything else in nutrition. And so I was just absolutely fascinated by it, and then the more that I learned about it, the more that it was one of those things where it's like, wait, maybe the gut microbiome is underlying everything. And so it just became a topic that I sought out everywhere I could. My sister's actually a microbiologist, and so we started having a lot more conversations after I really got into it. So it's been fun and very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting that you have that connection with your sister too. It's exciting to be able to have those conversations really get going.
They do, and it's actually really interesting because she keeps me on my toes, which means I'm not a microbiologist, so any information that I have, I've been researching on my own, and so she makes sure that I'm saying the right things and you know not coming up with theories on my own. She makes sure it's really well grounded in science. So.
Wonderful. Well, looking forward to this. And so, was this topic relevant to your master's thesis? I want people to know.
It actually is my master's thesis, how obesity and the gut microbiome are related. And it really came from, during my schooling at Hawthorn, I gained a lot of weight, and which is ironic, right? Because we're studying nutrition and health and wellness, and but through a series of things that happened in my life, my body stopped working the way that it was supposed to be working. And even though my diet was really clean and I exercised regularly, my body just kept gaining weight. And so it was definitely relevant to me. And so when I started studying this, and then we're going to talk about an experiment that I did at the end of the webinar and show you how I implemented the things that I learned.
All right, good. We're looking forward to that. So you want to speak just for a minute about how your Hawthorn education was for you?
Yeah, I actually, when I was looking to go on in education, I found Hawthorn because I really wanted something that talked about the body and nutrition, so the anatomy and the nutrition that went along with each of the areas of anatomy, how they work together, and Hawthorn was really the only program that had that was available online. And so it seemed to me like a perfect fit because it was everything I wanted to learn, and the program didn't fall short of my expectations. It was really great. Each class, at the beginning of the program, I was very scared because I was not retaining as much information as I wanted to, but my professor reassured me that there was going to be a lot more exposure and that I would really get it in the end, and I feel like I really did. And so you know, constant exposure you get more and more information. And so by the end, by graduation, I feel like I've gotten a pretty good education on anatomy, how nutrition works with the body, and you know what I can do to help people to learn those things too.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for that. And a testament to your research skills and putting together this presentation, I want to let everybody know that you've provided a full list of your references for this presentation. And James is going to have that posted to the webinar panel, if possible, during the webinar, several pages of references that you'll be able to download. And if we can't post it there, it'll be on the webinar panel under handouts. And if you don't find it there this evening, James will have it posted with the slides, and it'll be up under archive webinars on our website in just a few days. So a very valuable resource. Thrilled to see something like this come in always. So thanks for providing that too, Tami.
Absolutely. And actually there's a couple of references that I just got this week that are not on that list. So they will be on the slides. So if you need a couple extra references, they'll be there.
Okay. I just got a note from James saying that there's too many references. The document is too big to post with the webinar, but it will be attached to the slides when we are live and have it on our website in just a few days. So take a look for those when they're posted. All right, so I think that's it. I want to go right into getting you introduced. I know you've got a full talk to present, so I want to give you as much time as possible. Sound okay?
Awesome, thank you.
All right. So for those of you that just tuned in, I want to welcome you to Hawthorn University's webinar series, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paula Bartholomew. I get to be the moderator for this webinar, and Hawthorn welcomes Hawthorn graduate Tami Chu to present Obesity and the Gut Microbiome. So to frame this talk, Tami asks, have you ever wondered how your gut bugs compared to your ancestors? It's a question that I have never really considered before, so I'm excited about this presentation. Another question is if your gut inhabitants have more to do with your daily life than you thought. In this webinar, Tami talks about the gut microbiome as our own personal pet, discusses the links to obesity, describes her own personal microbiome experiment, and then shows some potential lifestyle adjustments we can make to stack the deck in favor of leanness and overall health. Tami Chu is a graduate of Hawthorn University's Master's in Holistic Nutrition. She's a lifetime educator with a second master's degree in deaf education. While homeschooling her kids and raising chickens, she ran a local buyers club and co-led the Weston A. Price Foundation's chapter in her area. And she currently teaches nutrition classes locally and hosts a brand new podcast called Organic Crumbs, all while starting her nutrition coaching business, Organic Crumbs Wellness. The podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all relevant podcast apps will pick it up. So look for organiccrumbs.com podcast. All right, Tami, as promised, I know you've got some terrific information to share, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be quiet now.
All right, thank you so much, Paula.
Okay.
I want to start actually by saying that this topic, obesity in the gut microbiome, is so completely current that that there's research that's coming out really every month. In fact, one of the studies that I'm going to talk about just came out about 3 days ago, and I had to rush and read it so that I could include the information, because the gut microbiome information has really only been out for about the last 10 years, and so so it's really cutting edge, and even following up on this and with the references, that the 13 pages of references that you'll be able to see later, there's still so much happening now. So this information could be expanded or even shifted as new information comes out. So let's get started with so we want to talk about what obesity is and what the gut microbiome is briefly, so that we have kind of common language as we go into it a little bit deeper. What is obesity? Obesity is a health condition in which excess body fat has accumulated to such an extent that health may be adversely affected. So really, any time that there's excess body fat, that causes a health problem. It's currently defined by body mass index, BMI, which is basically figured out by a calculation of your height and weight, and there are some difficulties with that, because just measuring height and weight is going to exclude issues like bone density or lean muscle mass, where if someone is more muscular, stronger, bodybuilders or professional athletes will actually test higher on the obesity scale, because their body mass index is going to be higher, because lean muscle is heavier than adipose tissue or fat. So that's one of the issues with measuring with BMI. And then we also have something called the obesity paradox, which is basically people who might be overweight or even fall higher on it's kind of the same thing, but it's people who are falling higher on the obesity scale by BMI, measured by BMI, whose blood markers are fantastic. They're very, very healthy. They don't have any disease markers, and since we're looking at it as a health condition, that could potentially lead to, adverse health issues. If your blood markers look great and you're physically healthy, then technically obesity would not be the term that would be able to describe a person like that. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have what's called skinny fat, which are people who are very lean, who are thin, who don't appear to have a lot of adipose tissue, but may have visceral fat, which is fat that would be abdominal on the inside of your body, so around your organs. And that's not necessarily going to show up on the BMI scale. The new study that came out this last week actually tested obesity rates by testing visceral fat, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so testing by visceral fat is much more accurate measurement, because the visceral fat is what is most commonly related to or associated with the diseases that obesity is related to. Our statistics in the United States is that, and this is this year, that nearly 38% of Americans are obese, and if you include overweight, we're at 67%. So obesity is a very relevant issue in the United States for sure, and it's becoming much more relevant globally. Now, there are differences in the obesity rates depending on socioeconomic groups, ethnic, gender groups. In women, obesity rates are higher than in men. I know it's not fair. And in some ethnic groups, you're going to see higher rates of obesity. And then socioeconomically, you see higher rates in poorer neighborhoods, poorer areas, which is what we would expect in places where food deserts, where you can't get access to good food, where there's not a lot of time to spend being healthy when you're just kind of in survival mode. So what are some of the complications of obesity? Why is it so important that we look into it and really solve this problem if we possibly can? Aside from the fact that in the 1960s obesity was nearly unheard of, and in 2016 now we're at 38%, a third of the country, we also have all of these different issues: pulmonary disease, liver disease, gallbladder disease. I mean, it goes on and on. Stroke, cancer, heart disease, all of these things are related to obesity. So it starts sometimes with obesity and then leads into these other health complications, even to the point of death. At this point in this country, 1 in 5 deaths are related to obesity or overweight. That's pretty profound, and something we really need to be concerned about. Before we go into the microbiome, the current mainstream belief is that obesity is caused mainly by an imbalance of energy in the body. In other words, calories in versus calories out. Now, anybody who has worked with clients or patients, or really who knows somebody who is obese, knows that it's not as simple as calories in versus calories out. And in particular, when I was dealing with it, I knew very well it was not about calories in versus calories out, because my calories out was higher than my calories in, and I should have been, very thin, and it wasn't working. It was actually having the opposite effect, and so I knew there had to be something that didn't work. So the new research that we have for the microbiome is starting to expose some of the problems with the whole calories in, calories out mainstream theory of causal factors for obesity. Because we have all these outliers who, and anomalies, who are gaining weight even though their food is fantastic and they're exercising really well, or they can't lose weight no matter what they do. We're now starting to look at other causes. What else could be the problem if it's not just a calories in, calories out issue? So then we lead over to the microbiome. And the microbiome is fascinating. Our ratio of bacteria to human cells is actually very close to 1:1. And in the research that I have in the PDF that you guys can download later, most of the studies that you'll see actually talk about us being outnumbered by bacteria 10:1. And pretty much everything up until May of 2016 had that information, that we were outnumbered. We were only, we're 1% human or 10% human based on the number of cells. And in actuality, in 2016, a group of researchers decided to figure out where that ratio number came from. And so they traced it back to a study in 1972 that was what they call a back-of-the-envelope estimation of how much of our body is bacteria and how much is human cells. And based on what they knew in 1972, which is completely different than what we know in 2016, they determined that we were, 10% human. And now the information in 1972 was never meant to be this jumping off point for all of these other studies. It was just kind of a rough estimate. Let's figure this out for our purposes. But every single study since then has referenced this number. And so this research group, and the paper was just published, came up with a new estimation based on what we know now. And they found, again, it's an estimation, so this number could change in another 5 years when we learn more techniques to learn about bacteria. But so our ratio is actually closer to 1:1. Now, that still makes us 50% bacteria, which is still pretty profound when you're thinking about taking care of your body. Because if you're taking care of your human cells but not thinking about your bacterial cells, then you're leaving out a whole 50% of yourself. And this ratio is so close that they estimate that the ratio actually shifts to be slightly more human after each bowel movement. And of course that makes sense, right? Because we all feel a little bit more human after a bowel movement. Our gut, just like the immune system, contains the most bacteria. About 70% of our 70 to 80% of our microbiome of our bacteria is actually found in our gut. And the body is like a planet. So we have this, and that's why this picture is so wonderful, because we are like a planet. Every part of our body contains a different ecosystem for different types of bacteria. So you'll find different species of bacteria, different families of bacteria in different parts of your body. So your mouth microbiome is completely different than your nose microbiome, and it's completely different than your gut microbiome, and under your arms, and even the skin of your forearm is going to be different from the skin of your palm. So we have whole ecosystems of bacteria living on and in our body. And I like to think of them like they're our pets, because what we're finding is that the gut microbiome in particular, but also the rest of the microbes on your skin, are intricately related to metabolism, brain function, immune function, epigenetic expression, methylation, disease development. And research is coming out fast and furious, connecting more and more disorders to something in your gut microbiome. And so if it's this key, if this connection is so key, then we need to be really looking at these living organisms that have evolved with us, that are working with us, to really take care of them so they can take care of us. And I wanted to talk about the terms abundance and diversity also, because we are going to be talking about that a little bit more. Abundance talks about how much of any type of bacteria in your body. And just really quick, the gut microbiome is not just bacteria. I mean, there's viruses, there's fungus, there's all kinds of other microbes in there, but a lot of the research right now is really focused on bacteria, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. So abundance is how much of that bacteria is there. Do you have an abundance of any particular species or any particular type, or an overall abundance? And diversity talks about how many different species that you have. So diversity is something that we strive for, because what we're noticing is that health is related to a very diverse microbiome. Now, the Western gut, the Western as in Western civilization, so urbanized society, industrialized society, barely resembles the guts of isolated indigenous people. And to kind of show a comparison, we're going to look at the Hadza tribe, which is important really because of their location. There have been a lot of researchers who have gone out to indigenous tribes across the whole planet trying to find people who are mostly uncontacted or have very little Western influence, to be able to test their gut microbiome, to test anything that they possibly can, to be able to compare it to the Western gut. And the Hadza tribe is a tribe who have really not had a lot of influence up until now. There's probably more influence now because they're so fascinating for researchers, so there's a lot more trips to go out there to see them. But they're in East Africa, which most scientists believe is the birthplace of early civilization. And so when we look at the Hadza tribe and where they live and how they live, they give kind of an indication of what our ancestry could possibly be. And so a potential for what our gut microbiome looked like before urbanization, before the industrial age, before westernized civilization. And one thing we notice, and this is true across many indigenous uncontacted or unwesternized tribes, is that they don't have any sign of what we call modern diseases, what are really Western diseases, which is cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cancer. These types of disorders are essentially they don't exist in these tribes. Of course, there is a balance. They have a 20% infant mortality rate, so their mortality rate is very high, so we can thank industrialized society for making ours so low comparatively. But they do live a long life, and they don't have any of these other Western diseases. They are a hunter-gatherer tribe, which means that they do both. They gather a lot of their food, and when they hunt seasonally based on what's available, based on the water seasons. So even their meat eating is very seasonal. So they live by the seasons. They live on the land very closely. And what they found about their microbiome is that they are so incredibly diverse and abundant that we don't even know some of the bacteria that's in their gut because we don't recognize it. It's not identifiable because we've never seen it before. So they have so much diversity compared to the Western gut. Their gut is like a rainforest, and our gut is like a tundra. So if we're doing a comparison, theirs is much more abundant, so many more species, so much more diversity. So it's fascinating to see the difference. And there are differences in more rural societies also, so you will see more diversity in rural groups, tribes, or just people. There's one, I think, in Spain, a rural area of Spain, where they tested the microbiome and compared it to some other children in a more urbanized area, and there was a difference in diversity there as well. So we definitely see that lifestyle has an impact on the microbiome. So how do we get our microbiome? Some of it actually comes from genetics. And the study that just came out this week did actually talk about the heritability, so how much of these microbes are passed down from parent to child. And there are actually quite a few obesity microbiome that are related to obesity that are heritable, that are passed down. So genetically, we actually get some of our bacteria, and then epigenetically, so what our mom eats pre-pregnancy and what our mom eats during pregnancy, and then also partly what she feeds us after pregnancy. So that's a really key time in developing our microbiome. Birth is another huge place where we actually attain bacteria. And initially, it was believed that the womb was a sterile environment, and they're finding that that's not actually true now. There's at least one study that talks about the placenta having its own separate microbiome, and they're finding that there's potentially a lot more bacteria interaction between a child in utero than they previously thought. So yes, we're getting some exposure there, but the majority of the exposure of our initial microbiome is through birth. And there have been a few studies that compare babies who are born via C-section to babies who are born vaginally. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that after birth, a few months after birth, babies who are born via C-section, actually their microbiome on their skin and even in their gut resembles the skin of hospital workers more than their mother's microbiome. And then babies who were born vaginally, their microbiome not only matches some of their mother's vaginal microbiome, but also their mother's gut microbiome. So it's fascinating to see that that birthing process is also a really important part of that initial bathing in bacteria. And at this point, with our C-section rate being about 37% in this country, that's a little bit of an issue. And there are a couple researchers, microbiologist researchers, who after they discovered this information happened to have partners or wives who were pregnant and getting ready to give birth. And the two that actually ended up with C-sections figured out a way to kind of get around, after knowing all of this information, how to get around that loss of bacteria, because it is a loss. And so what they did is they actually inserted gauze into the vaginal birth canal during the C-section, and then once the baby was born, they took that gauze and swabbed the baby completely all over, all his little crevices and creases, so that they would have that exposure to bacteria prior to, you know, being sped off into the world. Breastfeeding is another place where we get our microbiome, and they're discovering more and more about this. And actually, my sister, who is a microbiologist, is doing research right now in human milk. So there's actually a whole group that does research in human milk, and they're milk scientists. So there's a ton of information. And something very interesting is that when formula companies were formulating their formula, they looked at the composition of human breast milk to see how they could come as close as possible. You know, they have to add this and that and the other thing to kind of replicate what happens in human breast milk. But one of the things that they discovered in human breast milk that they thought, well, we're not going to add that to formula because it doesn't do anything, is something called human milk oligosaccharides. And the reason that they thought it didn't do anything is because these HMOs, not like your doctor HMOs, but these human milk oligosaccharides, HMOs, they were undigestible by the baby. And so formula companies didn't include them in formulas. But what they found out recently is that these HMOs actually feed not the baby, but the baby's gut microbiome. And so they're specific for bacterial feeding. And this is in the breast milk. So this is another area we're actually getting seeded. Our gut microbiome is developing, and it's an important part. So babies who are not breastfed, or even babies who are half breastfed and half formula fed, the babies who are half formula fed tend to have a gut microbiome that looks more like a baby who's formula fed and less like a baby who's exclusively breastfed. And, you know, if you can't breastfeed, I mean, you know, there are lots of ways that you can kind of get around that, and it's not going to, you know, be the death of your child if you can't breastfeed, but it is another important source of the microbiome seeding that helps us to develop health long term, because that's the other part of it. This idea that breast is best comes from studies that don't have anything to do with the microbiome, but what they're finding with the microbiome research attached to it is that the babies who are fed exclusively breastfed have less incidences of asthma, obesity, and some other respiratory disorders that are similar to this. Type 2 diabetes is another one. So breastfeeding is a really important component to seeding a proper gut microbiome. The next place after we are breastfed is we get it from food. And the beginning of our gut microbiome that looks like an adult is really at the cessation of breastfeeding. So when breastfeeding stops, we then go into a shift in children where their gut microbiome is kind of up in the air a little bit, but then it begins to start to look like what it's going to look like for the rest of their life. So it establishes kind of its home and how much diversity, how much abundance they're going to have as a microbiological signature for the rest of their life. And food is one way that they get the good bacteria to come in. And even related to dirt, because food that's grown in good soil, and this is another push for organics, carries with it some of the soil microbiome. And that soil microbiome is a very important part of feeding our microbiome. And so if you're eating a carrot that's just come out of the ground, if you just brush off the dirt and eat the carrot before you wash it, you're actually getting that soil microbiome into your body, and it's going to actually push you towards health, as opposed to, you know, it's not just dirty, it's actually giving you probiotics, essentially. So dirt is really important. You know, when you see little kids out there playing in the dirt, shoving handfuls of dirt in their face, they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing to seed their microbiome. So let them eat dirt, let them play in the mud, but try to make sure it's organic dirt, organic mud. And if you don't have access to that, you know, get them a little kiddie pool full of good organic soil and some plants that they can munch on and play in, because it really does help to build their microbiome. So little kids shoving everything in their mouth are actually doing what they're supposed to do to seed their microbiome. And then another place we get it is from pets and people. When they do research on people who are living together, their microbiomes tend to, like families, their microbiomes tend to be very similar in diversity. So they kind of collect the same bugs for their gut. And then pets actually give us a more diverse microbiome. So the more exposure you have to pets, there's a couple studies that show children who are raised on farms have more diversity in their microbiome than children who are raised in urban society, and a lot of it is the exposure to the animals. So if you don't have a pet, get one. Chickens are great, dogs are great. You know, we do definitely need those other organisms, those other species, to kind of help us to build our microbiome. So now that we've got our microbiome and it kind of is going to stick around for a while, how do we lose these microbes? And what, you know, because when we're looking at health issues, when we compare the microbiomes of healthy people to people who are carrying some sort of disease or have some sort of health issue, we recognize that the diversity and the abundance of the microbiomes are really significantly reduced. So how do we do that? What happens? What is it? You know, how do we lose it? So stress, which we all know stress is terrible for our bodies, and actually stress is terrible for your gut bugs too. It will actually destroy, because of the physiological responses that you have and the cortisol release and the hormone release that you have during stress, it actually goes in and destroys the microbes. So stress, trauma does the same thing, and this trauma could be one event. It could be chronic, you know, chronic abuse. It could be anything like that. But if you've had some sort of trauma or any kind of major stress in your life, really even low-grade chronic stress, these are things that can affect your microbiome. It can reduce the diversity of your microbiome and lead you into illness. Another one is antibiotics, and as we know, antibiotics are overused in this country. It's estimated that by the age of 2, children have had at least 2 rounds of antibiotics, and by the age of 9 or 10, they've had 10. So that's 1 per year at minimum. Children are getting rounds of antibiotics, and they are definitely finding that antibiotics, you know, they not only kill off the bad bacteria, but they also kill off the good bacteria. It's like carpet bombing. So it's mass destruction. And the research is showing that each subsequent round of antibiotics kills off more of the gut microbiome, to the point that by the 3rd round, there are going to be microbes that you had that you'll never get back. They become extinct in your gut because of the antibiotics. So that is an issue. The younger the children are who have the antibiotics, the more effect that has on their long-term health. So children who, who have multiple rounds of antibiotics at younger ages tend to have, again, higher incidence of asthma, diabetes, and potentially cardiovascular issues later on in life. So the problem with antibiotics too is that it's not just rounds of antibiotics that you're taking. We are exposed to antibiotics in multiple areas. One is in food, again, another push for organic food, because the confined feeding operations, where we get our meat from the grocery store most of the time, 80% of the antibiotics that are produced in this country go to feed those animals. So people are eating the antibiotics through their meat instead of consuming them from their doctor. The other part of antibiotics also is that it's in our water. We have so many pharmaceuticals in our groundwater in urban societies now that there are at least 2 studies in, I think, Mississippi and Ohio where they were testing to see, it was Michigan and Ohio. They found not only antibiotics, but antibiotic-resistant bacteria in all of the water sources, particularly in tap water. So we're bathing in it, we're drinking it, we're eating it, we're very exposed to, you know, in milk, it's everywhere. So even if we're not taking antibiotics, if we're not living a lifestyle that precludes our consumption of antibiotics, then we're getting subtherapeutic levels pretty much consistently. And those do affect our microbiome. Another area that affects our microbiome is diet. And again, glyphosate, which is the primary ingredient in Roundup, which is sprayed on 90% of the crops in the United States. Diet, so let's talk about diet for a second. I'm going to tell you a story. There was a scientist and his adult son who was in university in the UK, and the son decided to do a radical experiment because he wanted to test out some of the stuff his dad was looking into. So he had a terrible diet already, and he thought this experiment would be super fun and easy because it wasn't going to change his diet too much. And then the bonus would be that not only his dad could use it, but he could write up a paper and use it in university. So he decided that he was going to eat only McDonald's for 10 days. And he was going to test his microbiome before he started, during the experiment, after, and then several weeks after. Now, by the 5th day on this experiment, his friends were telling him he was looking a little gray. So I don't recommend this. Don't try this at home. But so the awesome thing was that he tested his microbiome. So after just 10 days, he had shifted several of the major phyla of bacteria in his gut by large percentages. And just a sidebar, when we're talking about bacteria, we got to go back to our high school biology class and remember the organization of organisms is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And when we talk about bacteria, we actually talk about those levels of organization. So that's something to refer back to later when you're thinking about it. But a lot of times when we're looking at bacteria, we're looking at the phylum level. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We're looking at the phylum level. So in 10 days, he had so shifted these major phylum of bacteria in his gut that that they were astonished. He shifted one from 25% to 58%. He shifted another from 70% to 38%. So he's actually shifting bacteria up and down based on what he was eating. After 1 week, he was still lacking in microbial richness, so his diversity had reduced tremendously, and months later, he had only gradually begun to normalize. So this is after only 10 days of McDonald's treatment. And then I think this was only a couple years ago, and so I haven't seen the results after a couple of years, but he definitely did not go back to his junk food diet after this. He was ready for salads and good protein for quite some time afterwards. And then in terms of glyphosate, because probably all the McDonald's had the glyphosate in it too, there have only been a couple of studies, but the major thing that they say about glyphosate is that the reason it shouldn't affect humans, at least this is the company line, is that it's non-toxic to mammals because we lack the metabolic pathway that glyphosate disrupts in plants. It's an herbicide. However, our gut microbiome actually has this same pathway, the is disrupted in plants. So what's happening is when we consume glyphosate, it does disrupt the metabolic pathways of our gut microbiome, which is a little bit scary. Because at last testing, glyphosate is found in everybody's bodies. And if you go do a tox screen, do a urine test tox screen, you will find that there's glyphosate in your body. I have not met one person who's done a tox screen that hasn't had some level of glyphosate in us. So that's another issue. Inflammation is another one. LPS is lipopolysaccharides. And this is something that's in the cell membrane of gut bacteria, of certain bacteria, gram-negative bacteria is what they call them, and which is fine. They're released during metabolism of the bacteria, and as long as they're encased in the gut, it's fine. They're processed through, the LPS is great, you can get rid of it. However, if there's any intestinal permeability, if there's any gut leakage at all, this LPS gets out of the gut, goes into the bloodstream, and begins to cause inflammation. So if we have any kind of issue in our gut, LPS becomes a source of inflammation in our body, and then it can lead to all kinds of other complications. The other area, and I'm trying to speed through this because we're going to try and get to all of it. The other area is circadian rhythm. And what's fascinating is that we recognize that our bodies don't do very well if we don't have some sort of pattern routine when it comes to light exposure and dark exposure. We're recognizing that light of electronics and cell phones and TVs are disrupting our circadian rhythm because of the blue light that's being emitted. And what we're learning is that circadian rhythm is important for the gut microbiome as well. If you have regular schedules of eating and of light and dark exposure, regular eating habits will increase bacterial activity when you typically eat. So when food is likely to be present, the bacteria gets a little more active, they get excited, they're like, yes, food's coming. And if you eat at odd times, your microbes lose the rhythm. They're like hanging out in the backyard when food is being served and they forget or they don't know that it's coming. And so what happens is the food is not digested properly. All of these wonderful things that the gut is supposed to be getting and being fed, they're kind of starving because they're not present, they're not active when food is present. And so not only can it change the composition of your gut because it's going to kill off some of those bacteria that are starving and feed ones that are not supposed to necessarily be fed because they're not in the right balance, this can really affect how your metabolism works, how your sleep works, and this actually can increase the bacteria that's associated with obesity and metabolic syndrome. So circadian rhythm is really important for our gut microbiome too. Who knew? Well, if you look at your children, children need that too. So why not do it with your gut bugs too? So an obesity microbiome. Is there an actual obesity microbiome? Well, what they found is that in humans there is a basic core microbiome at the phylum level. So our guts are made up of huge groups, like when you're classifying organisms, we've got mammals, we've got amphibians. So mammals are a huge group. So that's kind of what these represent. So Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, Actinobacteria, Proteobacteria, these are huge groupings of phylum level bacteria that make up a huge percentage of your gut. Now there are smaller, less abundant bacteria, and one of the things that they're finding is that these lower level abundant bacteria could actually have higher level functions in your gut. So none of these little tiny bacteria go to waste, and none of them are any less important than any others. It is important really quick to just acknowledge that in this huge group of Firmicutes, you have pathogenic and beneficial bacteria. And as we know, we need all of these bacteria. We need pathogenic and we need beneficial, and we need them all in the right balances because they all have a job to do. So the pathogenic bacteria has a job to do that's just as important as our quote-unquote beneficial bacteria. It just needs to be in the right balances so that we can stay healthy. It's when the pathogenic bacteria get too large that we end up with bacterial infections and other issues. So within these huge phylum level groups, we do have opposite functioning bacteria at lower levels, species level, family level, that kind of genus level. So bacteria. The first indication that we actually had an obesity microbiome was in around 2005. There's a couple studies before that, but this was in obese mice. So these are mice that are genetically bred to be obese and leptin deficient. So they're called obese. Now, they're bred, so they have their microbiome, and what they found was they had a lower abundance of the Bacteroidetes phylum level and a higher percentage of the Firmicutes phylum level than their lean counterparts. And this was replicated in another couple studies with twins. And so, of course, once you find something in mice, you want to see if you can replicate it in humans. And in 2015, there were a couple studies. There's a few studies in 2009 as well that where they studied twins who were disconcordant for obesity. Now, that means that there's a lean twin and an obese twin. And that's very handy for people to study because not only can they study the heritability of bacteria, but they can also study how similar they are, particularly in monozygotic twins, identical twins. And the study in 2015 showed the same ratios. So they showed that there was a much lower abundance of the Bacteroidetes and a much higher abundance of the Firmicutes. And they showed the same level in the twin studies. They also showed that there was a lower overall diversity. And remember, we've been talking about how diversity, higher diversity is a health marker. So lower diversity is common at the species level in the obese twins, not the lean twins. So the lean twins had a higher diversity. One of the studies that was done on the twins showed phyla level changes, again, up at the phylum level, that basically showed okay, so correlated to gene activation involved in extracting energy from food, indicating that people who are obese have phylum-level bacteria that are better at, more efficient at extracting calories from food. So a lean person and an obese person can eat the exact same amount of calories, the exact same amount of food, and the lean person will obtain less of the nutrients from that food because of their microbiome than the obese person, which means the obese person is getting more energy out of the food, having to store some of that energy as fat, and so now you've got the deck stacked against you just because of these microbes that are in your gut doing such a great job getting energy out of food. It's just not fair. And then this new study that just came out literally last week uses visceral fat instead of BMI, as I mentioned before. And it's this new technique called dual X-ray absorptiometry. If I said that right. And hopefully, because of this study, we're going to have a lot more studies that test based on this visceral fat instead of BMI, because all these other studies of obesity prior to this has been based on BMI, which means some of their measurements are not going to be completely accurate. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. So what this new study showed, and it's very complicated, but basically it shows that there are at least 97 operational taxonomic units, which is basically microbes, different level of microbes, that are associated with obesity, as well as heritability. So these same 97 microbes, bacterium, are also inheritable. So it's really important that when we take care of ourselves, we're looking ahead to our children and our children's children, because if we have all of these bacteria, then we're passing them on. They're heritable. We're passing on this obesity microbiome to our children and our children's children. And that's one of the studies that's not in the PDF, and so it's actually on this page. So going back to the lean and obese twins, one of the studies that they did after determining the differences in the microbiome was that they decided to take it one step further and transplant those microbes into mice. And so these are germ-free mice bred to be without germs. They fed them the exact same diet, low-fat, high-fiber diet. The microbial transplant into the mouse with the lean twins microbiome, they had no change in their body composition at all, and the mouse with the obese twin actually gained weight. Same diet, same exact diet. So there's clearly a correlation to gut microbiome and obesity, but we don't know yet if there's a causal factor as well. Now, just as a sidebar, they also did this study on mice living together. So these mice were separate. They had some with mice living together, and those mice, even though they both had the fecal microbial transplant, there was no change in the body composition. And they believe that it's because of the coprophagic behaviors of mice, which is they eat each other's poop. Again, don't try this at home. But because the obese microbiome mice potentially ate the fecal matter of the lean microbiome mice, they believe that that was enough to mitigate the changes. So there is hope. So, and I'm getting close on time, but I'm going to run through this. We go back and we look at fiber, because what is it that feeds the microbiome? We know all those things, that how we got our microbiome. Now, how do we feed these little gut bugs? One of the things that we know that happens in the gut that is very specifically related to the microbiome is short-chain fatty acid metabolism. So short-chain fatty acids are hugely related to metabolism, well established. Some of the most common ones are butyrate, acetate, propionate, formate. These are short-chain fatty acids, and they're, for example, butyrate is linked to maintaining the gut epithelium and the epithelial barrier. So that's a short-chain fatty acid that's really important to keeping our gut lining in place. Remember that LPS? The lipopolysaccharides, if our gut lining is in place, that LPS can't get out and cause havoc, wreak havoc on the rest of our body. So that epithelial lining is really important. And butyrate is one of those things. So short-chain fatty acids are actually formed through the fermentation of undigested carbohydrates. And so basically, the bacteria eats this fiber that comes in, this and produces as a I can't think of the word. It basically produces the short-chain fatty acids. So it's really important to feed these bacteria the right kind of food so that it will produce these short-chain fatty acids that go in and do all these amazing things in the rest of our body. So the current recommended daily intake for fiber in the United States is 38 grams a day for men under 50, 25 grams a day for women under 50, and then as you get over 50, you are supposed to eat a little bit less, apparently. 30 grams a day and 21 grams for men and women over 50. Now, per capita intake of fiber, so here's our goal, this lofty goal that we should be eating 25 and 38 grams of fiber per day. And what people are actually eating is 15 grams of fiber per day. Now, compared to the Hadza tribe that we looked at, they eat between 100 and 150 grams of fiber per day. So if we want our microbiome to look a little bit more like the Hadza, and we want our microbiome to do a little bit better, then we need to actually start eating a lot more fiber. And just really quickly, I'm going to run you through this study that came out just last year. In fact, right after my thesis was done, this study came out. And it's a mouse study, but it has huge implications for industrialized humans, which we are. So if you think about the industrial age that started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were eating a lot of fiber, and then we started eating a lot less fiber. And our percentage of fiber has tremendously reduced over the last 100 years, but our consumption of carbohydrates has not. So that's not necessarily a very good balance. So this couple at Stanford Medical School, School of Medicine, who's written a book, by the way, which is in the resources, and it's called The Good Gut, fabulous book, talks all about this stuff. So they did a study on mice, and they took germ-free mice, they populated their guts with a human microbiome, and they put them into two groups. They had the same basic diet of fat, proteins, all of that, and then one group was plant-derived fiber. They had high levels of plant fiber, and then the other group had the same diet except they were lacking the fiber. So then they tested the fecal samples of these mice. After 2 weeks on the fiber mice, no change. But after 2 weeks on the lacking fiber, they had reduced the abundance by more than half, reduced abundance, and by over 75% in some species. After 2 weeks, some species in the gut had completely disappeared. So they had completely eradicated them. So they continued this for 7 weeks, and then after 7 weeks, they switched back to a high fiber diet for 4 weeks. The low fiber mice who switched back to a high fiber diet had partial recovery, but a third of the original species never recovered. So they lost a third of the abundance of their gut after just a month of experimentation. Now the next step was breeding and maintaining the diet for several generations. So they kept these mice on the low fiber diet, kept these mice on the high fiber diet. The low fiber diet mice, the only microbial exposure that they had was from the parents. Okay. Now each successive generation lost more diversity and abundance, so that by the fourth generation of mice, nearly 3/4 of their bacterial species had been lost. And when they added back in the high fiber diet, 2/3 plus of the bacteria was irretrievable, thus extinct. So if we're looking at humans, we are looking at the third and fourth generation of industrialized humans right now in this in our society today. So on the upside, positive side, they did a fecal microbial transplant. So they took the fecal matter from the high fiber mice that had been generationally bred and gave them to the fourth generation of low fiber mice along with a high fiber diet, and within 10 days they had fully restored their microbiome to the original microbiome, and the two groups were indistinguishable. So there is hope for us. And then, so what can we do today to shift our microbiome? So some lifestyle modifications would be playing in the dirt. Make sure that you get out and garden, get in the dirt. The best case scenario would be organic soil with worms. We love that. Getting outside more, getting your body in tune with the circadian rhythm of your local area. So, you know, get light when light is out, get dark when dark is out. Get in tune with nature, what is outside. If you can drink spring water actually has bacteria that also feeds our gut, so there's a probiotic property to that, plus it's living. And then if we can get away from the city water with the antibiotics and the chemicals in it, we can actually restore some of that abundance into our guts if possible. One of the best ways to do that is findaspring.com, and you can usually find a spring within 45 minutes to an hour of your location on that website. Get natural movement. Movement is another area that really helps our gut microbiome. So natural movement is, if you think about hunter-gatherer, there's squatting, there's walking barefoot on dirt and grass and, you know, that kind of thing. Climbing trees, if you can go find a tree to climb, go climb a tree. Small sprints, you know, think of chasing animals, hunting, running from animals, hiding, all of these kind of natural body movements is really important. Resting well, obviously. Eat organic as much as possible so you can get away from the chemicals that are out there today. This is a big one for me. Increase your fiber intake to 60 to 80 grams a day. Do it slowly, otherwise you have a lot of bloating issues potentially. And also, if you're going to do this on your own, check with your doctor or check with your nutritionist or whoever you're working with, because some people really need to work on healing their gut before they get the extra fiber in, because we've already got some issues. So that's something that's really important to look at. And then focus on pre and probiotics. On one of my websites, tamichu.com, I have a fiber chart that you can download. You just put your name and email in, and it'll take you to a page, and you download this fiber chart. And it has lots of different types of fiber so that you can increase your intake. And it also has a section on prebiotic fiber. And that is basically very specific fiber that feeds your gut microbiome. So fiber in general is great, but these prebiotics are like key. They're like the you know, treats, the most important part for your gut bugs. And then probiotics are super important as well. And then check in with your ancestry to work the diet angle. So figure out what your traditional diets are and what kinds of foods that your ancestors would have eaten, and see if you can incorporate those into your diet. That's really important. And then the last one is to wash less. We take too many showers, we take too many baths, and we wash way too much. So we're washing away a ton of bacteria. Let your kids get dirty and stay dirty for a while. This is a really important component to building their microbiome and to building them into healthy adults. I'm going to skip over this because this was my experiment, kind of what I did, and you can kind of look back. It's basically.
Tami,
yes.
Tami, I love this experiment, and you know, take a few minutes and share it, please.
Okay. Okay, great. So I did a 12-week experiment, and I'm calling it Ancestral Wisdom because I'm actually developing it to do a group coaching project later. But basically, what I did is I decided for 12 weeks I was going to be as ancestral as I possibly could in our modern world. So all those lifestyle tips that I just mentioned, I tried to incorporate into my lifestyle for a period of 12 weeks to see if there was going to be a difference between my microbiome before and after. So I did a microbiome test. And there are two places where you can get this that's outside of a lab. You can do, like Genova Diagnostics does a fantastic microbiome lab, but it can be pretty expensive. And so there's these basically citizen science kind of labs that have popped up. One is the American Gut Project, which was started by a scientist named Rob Knight, and he made it so that people could send in their gut microbiome kits and have it be more affordable. And so that's $99 per kit, and you become part of this huge cohort that they're developing of to study the microbiome. So they're already using all of this information in a ton of studies. And in fact, the study that just came out last week used information from the American Gut Project. So you can actually be a part of the information that's coming. So uBiome is a for-profit company, and their biome kits are a little bit more affordable. If you get them on sale, you can get a really great deal, and they're $89 per kit. I actually found a sale where there was 3 for 1, so I got 3 of them for $89, and then I actually talked to uBiome and got them to give me a coupon code. So anybody who wants to get one, if you put in the coupon CRUMBS, C-R-U-M-B-S, you get 10% off of your microbiome kit. So I used uBiome, and I got a microbiome test at the beginning, and then I tested a month in, and then I was going to test at the end of the 12 weeks, but I decided in the middle that I was going to get the mercury out of my mouth before I tested, and so I just started that process. So I'm actually going to do the test as soon as the mercury is out of my mouth. So I've done the first 2. I haven't done the third one. So I have a front yard garden, so I worked in my garden every day. I cut out sugar, alcohol, dairy, except for butter, because who wants to leave butter behind? I got rid of most grains except for the occasional resistant starch. which would be like cooking potatoes and then chilling them, and that changes their molecular structure to make them more resistant to being broken down, so that they make it into your gut. They make it through the process into your gut where it can feed the microbiome. And then I increased my fiber to up to 60 grams a day. And not every day did I get enough fiber, but I definitely got close most of the time. I had already incorporated walking, and then during this time I also incorporated some weight training, and then at the end I incorporated yoga. And then some of the challenges was just getting enough food, because I was feeding my entire family at the same time. So any meal that I would make, I'd make this huge meal and it was gone. And when you're cooking mostly ancestral foods, it's really challenging to make a huge meal, because you're going to have to cook every meal. So if it's not as many people, if I do it again, I'm doing it by myself and not feeding my entire family this way, because I needed food to last a couple days. And so if I'd made a big meal, it would have been lunch the next day and lunch the next day and maybe another meal also. But the way that it worked, my kids ate a lot. So I would do that differently next time. And then the cost was a lot more, because I was really focused on organics and making sure that, you know, everything that I ate was clean, and so and wild, you know, because I was getting wild meats. And so one of the
Will
ways.
you give an example of one of the meals that you would have put together?
Sure. So we, let's see. So I did one with chicken. I had pastured chicken, and I took zucchini, because that was in season and I was growing it in my garden, and I actually zoodled them, so because you've got to make them fun, right? So zoodling is basically making noodles out of your zucchini, and you can get a vegetable spiralizer for, you know, $20 or whatever, or you can just cut them into strips. And then I did, because my family, I'm not Chinese, but my family is, and so I was kind of trying to balance their ancestry and my ancestry. So I would do, so I did zoodles, the zucchini, the chicken, which I seasoned with a little bit of tamari and some rice vinegar and salt, pepper, garlic, onion, and then bell peppers, a lot of vegetables I got from my garden, carrots, some cilantro, and I think there were at least 2 more vegetables that I threw in there. And then cooked the chicken, tossed everything together, and then that was my meal. So I just made a lot of it, as much as possible. And then so the chicken marinade, I set aside some for the vegetables, and that would be part of it too. So it was a very, and of course this was during the summer, so this was a very fresh and light and, you know, delicious meal.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, sure. So, and then now for me, in the 3rd week of this experiment, I had about 4 days of flu-like symptoms, and nobody else in my house got sick, and so I attributed it to potentially my body detoxing, because my diet was so fresh and so much more. I mean, we weren't doing noodles except for zucchini noodles or carrot noodles, or, you know, so it was just so fresh and so light that I attributed it to potentially detoxing all the systems in my body and releasing fat. So that was a 4-day where it was really hard for me to keep going, and that's a possibility, I think, in any kind of experiment like this. And then the hardest part was also my family's attitudes, because they called it the diet. Even though there weren't a ton of changes that I made for them, it was that they couldn't have their cereal on 1 day a week, or they couldn't have, you know, I made coconut milk ice cream instead of raw milk ice cream, and so they were mad they couldn't have their raw milk ice cream. So anyway, I'm going to do it without them next time. And then this is kind of our before and after the results. Now, I had started walking about probably 8 to 9 months before this, like really consistently walking about 3 to 5 miles a day. And so These are pictures of me before in 2015 and then after in 2016. And I wanted to kind of point something out because before this experiment, I really hadn't weighed myself much in the last 5 years because you really get discouraged and things like that. But during the experiment, I only lost 12 pounds. That's three months basically, and I only lost 12 pounds. But when you look at the measurements on my body, you start to go, wow, there's a tremendous difference. And the reality is I went from, I'm going to be really vulnerable here, I went from a size 18, high 16 pants at the beginning of this experiment, and I was down to size 14 at the end. So even in that 12 pounds, that's a really big difference. So I lost, I only measured myself in 4 different places. I wish I had done more because then I would have a much bigger number of total inches that I lost. But basically in all the areas that I measured, I lost between 3 and 3.5 inches, which is pretty awesome. And then the charts over on the side there are my uBiome data. So uBiome has a website, and once they have your information, you can actually go onto their website and you can compare what happened at the beginning and at the end of your experiment, or just what your gut looks like, or anything. So this first one on the top is actually my comparison of the first microbiome kit and the second microbiome kit. And if you look at the chart, you can see the Firmicutes reduced by 10% in 1 month. And my Bacteroidetes, which is the one that you want more abundance in, particularly when you're going against the obesity, increased by almost 12%. And then on the bottom, it's just another chart that shows a different way to look at it, and it individualizes the bacteria by percentage. And so if you can see, this is the first one, so Firmicutes 63.6%, Bacteroidetes was 30%, Proteobacteria 4%, etc. And then after was Firmicutes 55%, Bacteroidetes 42%. So there was definitely a shift, and it was only in 30 days. And so I think that there's hope. I mean, physically I saw a difference, but also microbiologically I saw a difference. And I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to keep testing and seeing how much it really shifts and how much it really changes. So there you go. So resources are available as a PDF, and the fiber chart's available on tamichu.com. And check out my podcast, because this is what I sound like, and we talk to a lot of fun people. And even one of our Hawthorn professors was on just this week, and was a really fun conversation. So there you go.
Who did you have on this week?
We had Dr. Bianca Garilli.
Awesome. Very good.
Yeah,
Very
she's
good.
wonderful.
Dr. Janet Ledwig is also, has done a lot of research in microbiome and a good bit of writing and things. So check her out too.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, we went long. I'm going to go with a few questions here, but I really appreciate this talk a lot. You talked about using antibiotics and never getting some bacteria back.
Yes.
And I wonder why. Is that just because it's not possible to be exposed to some of these strains again?
It is. That's part of it, and I think a lot of these experiments, they are not looking at adding in probiotics or, looking at eating from the soil and eating, really organic, freshly grown foods that really do come from the soil. So I think when you're looking at the studies, you're not going to necessarily see what is possible. You're just going to see what happens.
Okay. And you also mentioned about the benefit and need for pre and probiotics. And again, they're going to be limited to the strains that are available. So while beneficial, do you really see them able in a supplement form like this to really be able to populate the gut? Or are they just supplying bacteria as they move through?
That's actually a really good question, because what they've found with probiotics is more like when your mom comes to visit and cleans up your house, and makes sure that you're fed and leaves behind a much better place than when she got there. And that's kind of what probiotics do. They come in, they clean things up, they make things pretty, and then they move on. So they're not necessarily populating the gut unless you're getting things like soil-based microbiome or soil-based probiotics, or probiotics that are actually in the foods that you're eating, fermented foods, that kind of thing. So, but if you're taking them as a supplement, they definitely are showing benefits, and there's a ton of companies that are really experimenting with them to see what they can do, and develop better products and things like that. But yeah, they come in like your mom and fix everything up. So it is really important to keep taking them, even if they're not going to necessarily populate your gut.
Okay, thanks. And another question about the circadian rhythm issue. It was very interesting. And then talking about the Hadza tribe, they're hunter-gatherers, and so they eat what and when they find it. They don't eat on a schedule, and that they have the best microbiome that you framed here. So it's curious to me the encouragement to eat on a schedule.
Well, they don't necessarily not eat on a schedule, because even though they're hunter-gatherers, they still have a schedule that's based on the time of day. So when you're getting up in the morning, we think of them as like, oh, well, they're free and they do whatever and they hunt and they find whatever they can. But there's a part of, they're during the day they're gathering the fibrous roots that they get, and so as they're digging those up, they're chewing on them. So they're chewing on that throughout the entire day. Their food, you're right, is available based on when it's available, but it's also seasonal, and it's also, there's a time of day that they know the animals are going to be at the watering hole, and so that's when they go to hunt. And so there is a kind of natural circadian rhythm that comes with living in tune with nature, because nature has a circadian rhythm. And so we, even the habits of the animals that live in the wild also have kind of a rhythm. I mean, I have chickens, and they get up at a certain time every day, and they go to bed at a certain time every day, and they eat at a certain time, and they rest at a certain time. So, nature has that circadian rhythm just as much, which is why our gut does, because our guts represent that kind of nature connection in a lot of ways.
Thanks. And then staying on the theme of ancestral diets, and just I mean, we have our recent ancestors, but we're all from Africa, so like how far back do we go?
Right. Well, I was looking back about 500 years. So it's going back as far as you can to get out of industrial age. So if you only go back 150 years, that's okay too. I mean, that's traceable, right? That's only 5 or 6 generations. And a lot of times 150 years ago or 200 years ago, our ancestors would have dietary patterns that were closer to our further back ancestors. So, I mean, if you want to go Hadza tribe, go for it, but more likely to benefit you is just going to go back 5 or 6 generations outside of the industrial age and try to incorporate as many of those traditional habits as you can into your modern day life, which is a little challenging.
Great qualification, thanks. And just a couple other points. You brought up skinny fat, and so in the obesity section, it was interesting to me because people can present as thin, and I've worked with people that have had injuries, or there's a reason that they're not physically active for some period of time, but didn't gain weight, and so they're still presenting as very thin, but their body ratio, fat to lean muscle, has changed dramatically, and so they're much higher fat ratio. So I wouldn't say that somebody was actually obese in a situation like that, but could have an unhealthy fat ratio. And is that relevant at all in this orientation?
Yeah, actually, and that's exactly what I meant by skinny fat. It's a higher ratio of fat to lean tissue, but on the BMI scale, they don't show up. So they have maybe health markers that are tending towards inflammation, which is what obesity really is a disease of. And so they're going to have health markers that are tending them towards potential health issues that may be related to obesity, but they never gain weight, and they never look like they have the same health issues. And again, your higher fat ratio also might be in that visceral fat area. And visceral fat is where we really are concerned, because that's, that's the fat that grows around, that comes around the organs and in the abdominal area. So that's really where we need to focus instead of looking at BMI. But yeah, that's absolutely relevant.
Okay. Well, one of the big takeaways here is pretty much act like a kid, get out and play, right?
Yes.
And I'm just so grateful for when I grew up, because I played, I climbed trees, I ran around the rivers, I was always in the dirt, I had rocks and sticks and bugs and all kind of things in my pockets all the time. And I see pictures of my nieces and nephews, and when I'm around them, they're constantly being cleaned, they're constantly getting their clothes changed. It's like, let them play.
Yes.
Just let them play.
Exactly. We're too
So my encouragement here is we're in the fall season. It's here in the United States. It's a great turn of season. Leaves are falling. Things are decaying. We've had our first rain. The mushrooms are popping immediately. Chanterelles are up. The first porcinis will follow in about 10 days. So get out, play, have fun, act like a kid. Dig around in there. Build your microbiome.
Exactly.
Tami, this was a great presentation. I really appreciate all you brought to it. Fabulous research. I want to remind people that these slides will be posted in just a few days when James gets the webinar rendered, and it'll be up under archived webinars. And your multi-page resource will be included too. So thank you all for that. I want to remind you that our next webinar is in 2 weeks on October 20th. We have Dr. Kelly Brogan with us. I'm very excited about this. Her book is just terrific, and it's taking storm in the psychiatry sector today. So the presentation is Psychoneuroimmunology and the New Psychiatry. I've wanted this webinar for a while. I'm glad to have it. It should be excellent. I hope you show up for it. We'll open the call at 3:50 Pacific time for our announcements. And oh yeah, tomorrow we've got Megan Fisher for All About Alumni. So that's it. I'm going to let us all go have our meals and conclude our day. This concludes today's presentation. Thanks again, Tami. Thank you for sharing such a great presentation. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. And thanks, everybody, for sharing this time with us. I wish you all the best of health. Let's come back together again. Until then, get out and play.